Namaste, Keseho. Hello, how are you? This is Pete, your fellow student in Introduction to Archaeology, speaking to you from Cochin, India, on the southwest coast of India. It's where I find myself when the assignment is due. My paper is on generally underwater archaeology. Could be marine archaeology, but marine is usually left for salt water, and underwater takes in salt water and potentially fresh water, as my studies led me to find. My question was, for this paper, what, if any, techniques can be used from the terrestrial archaeological sites on underwater sites? And if they can be used, will those techniques work in the deep sea below 200 meters, where people cannot go with standard diving gear that we can articulate and move about a site? In other words, it has to be done remotely or via sub with arms or something like that. That's what I wanted to find out, was the current technology, if our traditional methods would work deep in the sea. I didn't have just 4 articles. I had a plethora of articles, and I narrowed them down to just 16. I'll try to be brief because of the large number. I have them in chronological order as they're presented in my paper. First is from Atwood and others, and it's called The Lost Island of the Maya. And this was an island that was in a volcanic lake in the highlands of Guatemala. And they believe that the one drainage source, which was a outfall down into a river system, became clogged by debris and lava flow from a nearby volcanic eruption. And within a year or two, with nowhere for the accumulating water to go, it washed over and submerged that island. Now, this was discovered by a scuba diver, a recreational scuba diver, who took photos, took it to an archaeologist, and then the site, over years, was investigated. And the article went much more into the religious significance of the site, which was very interesting, but I was more interested in, here is a site that was once terrestrial, but now it's underwater. And just as a way of illustration, how these things can happen over time. The next article that I got into was about the contours of paleo coastlines at Liman Tepe, which is off the coast of Turkey. And there were many archaeological forays into this area, but it became apparent that things didn't seem to match up. So they started doing coring samples and looked at other data they could find from paleo-environmental studies, and found that the coastline changed greatly. In fact, some natural harbors, where they would later find quite a few artifacts, had been filled in with silt and became a landmass upon which agriculture and building took up over it. So knowing what was there on the coast, or in that particular civilization near the coast, is very important for our work. The next article I used was actually the first article I came across in my research, and this was involving a study in Lake Huron, and it was shallower parts of Lake Huron in Paleolithic times that shows signs of habitation, hunting blinds, and animal runs, artificial animal runs to pull the herds together so it's easier to pick them off. This was unknown. They suspected that they might find something there. Previous studies of the Great Lakes had been based on general sea level rise, but when they took that into account, they couldn't find any artifacts, and they knew there would be something that close to the shoreline. And so they took into account glacial melting, and the actual Earth crust is weighed down by the frozen ice of a glacier. And as it melts, of course, the meltwater starts shaping the crust or the land. But after that weight is removed, the continental plates, the tectonic plates, pop up. And there's some vertical play until they stabilize. But it was quite a difference in the levels. And so at one time, in Paleolithic times, that was dry land. And when they took that into account, they knew about where to look to start finding evidence of features that could lead to more finds. This is all part of my laying in the background for this topic, and that the land keeps moving. Regardless of what we think it is today, it's probably not where it used to be for the time period we're studying. The next piece I came across was for radiocarbon dating, but the basics we know from our coursework, but as we know, it's measuring carbon over time as the isotopes decay. Well, this study, which was done in the Aegean Sea, was measuring the difference between the results of tests and the known age of certain samples that were taken. Because through the whole process, the chemistry of gases between the air and the ocean pulls in oxygen and, carbon dioxide, and releases oxygen. The plants, the plankton, the photosynthesis plants in the water need the carbon dioxide, and it's part of the cycle. And so we have this carbon from the gas exchange, as well as the great ocean conveyor, the deep ocean currents that spool and turn over water around the world from the depths to the top and back again, bringing up organic matter, and how that can interfere with the carbon isotopes that we're measuring. So you need to determine the reservoir, the difference between the true age and what the dates are telling. Just one thing we have to worry about in marine environments that we might not have to worry about on land. Another article, again for issues in dealing with marine archaeology, involves coring by diver-assisted coring as a means of not only determining where artifacts may be and the strata, but also limited intrusion on the site. The sediment, silt, whatever it happens to be on the sea floor, when it gets suspended up into the water column, it affects the light penetrating down to the photoplankton, the plant life in the water that is the basis of the food chain for all of ocean life. And so we can devastate ecologically an area if we're churning up silt and wholesale removal of sand and other strata layers to try and find artifacts. So this is a limited impact method to detail some survey work. Also, in dealing with the background in marine environments, salt water is very corrosive to metals and to other materials as well. And the chemistry gets a little heavy, but another article on reburial of archaeological remains, if they are metal, showed that when they are buried 50 centimeters down in the sediment in which they were found, they at least double their life before they're structurally dissolved. Some metals quite a bit more than that. So I'm using that as part of the background of things we have to adjust versus what we're used to on land. Another study, which was done off of Naples, Italy, on Roman architecture, was looking at stoneworks, carved stones, different types of stones, sandstone, marble, and seeing how the biological creatures in the ocean on the sea floor had affected it. Boring sponges, for example, boring into the stone and degrading it. And it's quite significant. It's a very interesting article. Another article that I used was Settlement and Colonization on a calcaneous substrata. Here, in a similar area off the coast of Naples, they took coupons and they submerged them on the sea floor and measured how quickly marine life deposited itself onto these samples and how much damage was done to the samples. So this gives us baseline data in a particular area underwater that we can rely on in measuring what we see when we find other sites in that area. The next articles deal with my example articles, if you will, because our assignment was to pick an archaeological site and follow that particular site through and how it was dealt with and what was learned from it. I have two articles, and they involve the same area written by the same person, different, separated in time, one in 95 and one in 2005 for follow-up studies in the general area. And this was fascinating stuff. The paper could have been just on this alone, but I didn't want to lose focus of where I was going with underwater archaeology and the techniques involved with it. But what was very interesting was off the south coast of Belize in lagoons, she was able to determine in these Maya lowlands that what is out under the water now was relatively flat, dry land for late classic period Maya. And on one particular lagoon, Stingray Lagoon, they went out, the water was shallower than a meter, so they're going around, doing their walking around, gritting it out as they would on land, except they're up to their waist or chest in salt water. So they put up nets to keep out predatory fish for the protection of the team, and they had a transit, and they would use stadia, that's what the guy holds, that's checkered, that the surveyor actually looks through to determine the height and the angle. And they put those up on concentrations of artifacts that they could readily see with just a snorkeling mask or just looking down through the clear water. They were there for anyone to see sitting in the silt. And so they were able to grid out a system that way and start looking at some samples. And they found things related to salt production. They found 4 different sites in that lagoon. Well, in 2005, they came back in the same general vicinity, and they found 41 more sites. And also interesting was that at these sites, they didn't find other evidence of settlement. There weren't animal bones, fish bones from debris pits. There was not the type of pottery shards found that would have been for everyday household use. This seemed to be purely a production area. There were also no stone tools, which late classic period Maya used, and there was also no imported obsidian for obsidian tools in this area. Now, Wild Cane Cay nearby was known as a trading center, and those items are found there. So perhaps all of these salt processing areas were to supply the inland cities with salt who were salt deficient. I'm not going to go into more great detail. It's in the paper. You'll see it for yourself and the references to the articles. It's pretty fascinating stuff. But they also found wood pilings for buildings that were preserved down in peat bogs from the mangrove trees in the area below the silt layers. And I think 23 sites had this preserved wood, which is very irregular in studying that period in Mayan history, including a paddle, the first ever wooden paddle to be found, which confirms some of the artistic drawings of the use of canoes and may lend credence to, yes, there was actual trade up the river system towards the inland cities of perhaps salt and perhaps other items as well. Amazing stuff, but we don't have time to get very far into it. I have to cover all my papers. The next one I picked was in my discussion section, which was the advantage of wrecks. And this is Gibbons. And he lays out a nice, generally, what are some of the issues in underwater archaeology. But you can tell from his perspective and passion that he has a great love for wrecks. And I use this article to reference his quotes on it and perspective that wrecks are a microcosm of that particular culture. There's no debris pits that were thrown away. Everything is very efficient. If it doesn't work and function properly, they get rid of it, fix it, or replace it. If you think about shipping throughout our remembered history, this is very true. So when you have a wreck, you have an excellent sample to pull on. Next, from Mr. Singh, the basics of sonar and side scanning buoys. There are many articles out there. I use this as a nice foundation article. It's from 2000. It's relatively recent, but explained the processes fairly simple. And this was at the advent of starting to really use sonar for archaeological exploration and documentation. A further refinement was from the next article, Photogeometry for Virtual Exploration of Underwater Archaeological Sites by Drapp. What was really fascinating, it's a 2006 article, to me, is that they had, with sonar and optical scanners, mapped out amphora, or wine and other liquid containers from antiquity, kind of long clay bottles, if you will, fairly large. And there's a huge field of them from Iraq, but it was shallow enough that they were able to also retrieve some of those items and match them up over their acoustic and optical scans that get overlaid and form mosaics, and begin to make adjustments with the known physical measurements of some of these amorpha that they brought up to calibrate the sensors, so that now we could use this remote equipment, acoustic and optical based, that we could actually use to take measurements with the software with. Now we're starting to get into refinement of technology that we could go to the deep sea, where we physically can't go and still articulate around a site. Next came another terrific article. It's a huge article. It's the 2005 Chios, I hope I pronounced that right, shipwreck. This was in cooperation between some U.S. researchers, academics, and Greek researchers, academics. And they knew there was a 4th century BC ship, and they wanted to get more data on it. Additionally, there was a suspected Roman period ship on the other side of Chios. They believed it was 4th century AD, and they started to use automated underwater vehicles. The remote vehicles, the ROVs, have heavy cable tethers, and the ship has to have spatial navigational equipment and side thrusters that automatically position the ship, because if the ship starts to drift, it'll just yank the submersible right along with it, mucking up the whole thing. So what's great about the AUVs is they don't require that. They're completely independent. They're pre-programmed software. And this was the first use of AUVs in an archaeological investigation. And they had improved optical sensors, acoustic sensors, but they also incorporated into the package environmental sensors for salinity, conductivity, which tells you salinity, and for other chemical species in the water. And now they can lay chemical maps over the acoustic and optical mosaics. So, and we can tell intruding chemicals that might come into the area from modern day human pollution, past pollution, oil spills and the like from the residues, as well as the residues of biological life that had developed and still their organic matter might still be laying around, and then the biologics coming in to feed on that. So pretty fascinating stuff. It's a huge article, but worth your time if you're into it. And now I come to the last two articles that I relied upon. And one is on Pearl Harbor and the excavations that are ongoing, especially on the USS Arizona, which is both an archaeological site and a grave site and a monument. And I wanted to mention this because it's just kind of cool, it's Pearl Harbor. But also, what they found out that they assumed they knew, but they really didn't. And here's something near the surface. Everybody knows where it is. There's a big white monument sitting on top of it. And yet they still knew so little of the actual truth of the history and what's physically going on with the site now, and why it hasn't corroded through, the structure remains intact, and so forth. And that's all in the article, some of the information they found. But I also wanted to, not only because it's the most recent 2017 article, and talking about some of the latest refinements in remote sensing, but also because this is a perspective that lends itself well to the deep sea environment. We're not going around anytime soon and having a party down on a wreck in the deep sea. It's just not physically going to happen. Everything's going to have to be done remotely. And here it's being done remotely by choice to respect grave sites of over 1,000 U.S. sailors. So kind of interesting that way. And in the course, we talked about the Native Americans and their grave sites versus archaeological interests and so forth. And this kind of brings this home for everybody, not one particular subculture in the United States, but for all of the United States. I mean, the Arizona Monument is an icon of the entire country. So I just felt an interesting enough perspective with the technology used there that's directly applicable to the deep sea, just coming at it from different angles, different perspectives. That's why I put that one in there. And with my seminal article, what is the current state of art, the best of the best now? And that comes from the archaeology of the Titanic. Yes, the Titanic. Initially, it was gone after for commercial profit, but when archaeologists got involved, they didn't do so bad a job with the technology they had available, this commercial company that initially exploited some of it. It is now under protection, some limited protection. It's in international waters. But this gets into some of the latest updates to the acoustics, especially the optics. And now it's of such detail. This is fascinating, down to the centimeter size of resolution, that now, if you have access to it, you can walk virtually on the deck of the Titanic, on the seabed floor, in and about the artifacts and features, as if you were physically there. They have it in virtual 3D with, hit another button, and you'll get a digital grid that's entirely mapped out, coordinates are there, unit measures are there to process the site as we would as if it was on dry land, but in the virtual. We cannot change physics. We can't force our bodies to go where they can't physically go. But the technology has now risen to the level that we can virtually go there, and we can take quantitative measurements, and we can do the things that we need to do, at least for now, until such time as we might need to retrieve those artifacts if further preservation is needed. But certainly, leaving things as they are is sometimes the most difficult, but sometimes the most important thing for archaeologists to remember. And where do we go from here? Who knows what the future holds, but the technology for us to go virtually, pun intended, anywhere is here. Thank you very much for your time.